Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome to the program Frank Gaffney. He is the president and CEO of Center for Security Policy. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
Let me begin with a piece that you posted this past week on your website, written by Caroline Glick on Iran's global reach. She says that President Obama is underestimating the threat that Iran is posing. How so?
Carolyn is our senior Middle East fellow and is based in Jerusalem and therefore has an advantage on what is developing in terms of the Iranian threat, existential threat to Israel, that I think is clearer than perhaps that seen from Washington. What Carolyn is talking about is the emergence of two unmistakable trends. One, the continuing development of the infrastructure that will give Iran the capability to produce nuclear weapons. Centrifuges now by the thousands that are spinning to process enriched uranium into weapons-grade material. The second trend is the development and now the deployment of ballistic missiles. The most recent one just last week with sufficient range not only to reach all of Israel, but much of the Middle East and, in fact, southern Europe. Those two taken together will give the Islamic Republic of Iran, as the president is fond of saying, the capability to act on the threat that President Ahmadinejad has repeatedly made to wipe Israel off the map. It also, I worry, may give the Iranians the capability to act on another threat that President Ahmadinejad has repeatedly made, which is, in what he says, the not only the desirability but the achievability of bringing about a world without America.
Now, the backdrop to this, there's an election in Iran slated for June 12th, and relations between the Iran and U.S. and these nuclear weapons are playing out in that race. What impact will all of this have on President Obama's policies towards Iran and what ultimately may happen in terms of whether there's a thawing of relations?
Well, it's not clear that any of this will play a role in the Iranian elections, because after all, the Iranian elections are essentially an exercise in power by the mullahs who actually run the place. They decided which of the four candidates will be able to stand for election. There's a report just in this morning that the so-called reformists among the candidates are having their Facebook pages blocked so as presumably to impede their ability to use that vehicle to muster out support from younger voters who clearly don't like the regime, who clearly, like most of the Iranian people, have no use for this despotic, repressive Islamic regime. But nonetheless, the way the game is run right now, it's a rigged game, and therefore I don't know that it will make any difference whatsoever. Even if somehow Ahmadinejad, who I think is the regime's favored candidate still, were to be voted out, you would still have the mullahs calling all the shots.
Were you able to watch the body language between President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when the two met in the Oval Office? Did you happen to see the video?
Yeah.
Reaction to that and your thoughts on their relationship?
Well, I have to say, I'm not so big on the personal relationships between leaders. I think much is made of it, way too much is frankly made of it. Nations have interests, and I think what the body language suggested was both of these men were trying to put on a pleasant face for their respective constituencies, but in fact the underlying drama of an Israel that is, as I said, increasingly facing an existential threat from Iran is finding the United States government not only seemingly completely insensitive to Israel's concerns about that threat, and compounding it by buying more time for the Iranian regime to pursue those two trajectories, the missile and the nuclear weapons trajectories. But in addition, I think that the Israeli government is now confronting an Obama administration that is seeking deliberately to weaken Israel in the interest of trying to force Israel into making territorial and other concessions to the Palestinians that will give rise to the so-called two-state solution. I think that's the backdrop that's much more important than the sort of atmospherics of the meeting.
Let me put a few more issues on the table. Remind our audience that you can phone in. The number's on the bottom of the screen. As always, Also send us a Twitter at CSPANWJ, or you can send us an email, journal@cspan.org. Our guest is Frank Gaffney. Trudy Rubin this morning in the Philadelphia Inquirer saying that there's a window of opportunity for U.S. in Pakistan. She writes, finally some good news from Pakistan. U.S. officials have a dramatic opportunity to help make roll back some of the gains made by the Taliban militants. Simultaneously, they can reverse widespread Pakistani public hostility toward the U.S.
Maybe. I think the window she's referring to is that the Pakistani government has taken steps, quite aggressive steps, to reverse a mistake they made 2 months ago, which is to say to surrender an important area known as the Swat Valley to these Sharia adherent Taliban. Sharia being, of course, the term that authoritative Islam uses to describe how the world should be run, as well as how individuals should practice their faith. The Taliban not only imposed Sharia brutally on the people of the Swat Valley, but they then proceeded to continue to arm themselves, and not only arm themselves, which they were not supposed to do under this deal, but to move inexorably closer towards the capital of Pakistan, which is only about a day's drive at most from the Swat Valley. So this window is perhaps open because the Pakistanis seem for the moment to have repulsed the Taliban in the Swat Valley, to have attacked them there, and maybe, for the moment at least, undermine their ability to exercise the control they had there and the base of support that they were then building. But the underlying problem, which I think Trudy's piece doesn't adequately address, is the government of Pakistan itself is, in many cases, directly responsible for the Taliban problem. They have been supporting them, they have been arming them, they have been providing them intelligence, and that makes it much more difficult to see how this thing is going to play out, other than over time the continuing rise of the Islamists in the Pakistani government, as well as in the Taliban community.
Let me move on to another issue that continues to play out, to use your words, in the Sunday morning newspapers. This is the piece in the Washington Post, and the speeches by President Obama at the National Archives and former Vice President Dick Cheney at AEI. And here's part of what the president said last Thursday.
So the record's clear. Rather than keeping us safer, the prison at Guantanamo has weakened American national security. It is a rallying cry for our enemies. It sets back the willingness of our allies to work with us in fighting an enemy that operates in scores of countries. By any measure, the cost of keeping it open far exceed the complications involved in closing it. That's why I argued that it should be closed throughout my campaign, and that is why I ordered it closed within 1 year.
Frank Gaffney, from your perspective, did the president and his administration think this thing through?
No, they didn't, and I think they made a terrible mistake in not thinking it through. There was clearly abundant evidence that he intended to close the facility, which is, by the way, the state-of-the-art, most secure interrogation and detention facility in the world today. We've spent over $200 million on that facility, bringing it up to that state. It has securely housed the most dangerous people on the planet. And in failing to think through, let alone adopt a plan for what to do with those people before announcing that he was going to close it, I think he has erred. And I pray that, as he has on a number of other issues, he will decide better of that decision and reverse it. But this has now become something of a test of manhood. I guess it will fall to the United States Congress, which has expressed itself on the subject rather forcefully in the past 2 weeks, to prevent him from taking a step that I think is neither, as he has described it, this terrible blight on America and a recruiting tool that our enemies will, continue to benefit from as long as it's open. Frankly, to the contrary, I believe that were we to close it, our enemies would consider it a strategic victory of the First Order, and that would be more likely to translate into increased recruitment and increased aggressiveness on their part.
I want to follow up on that point in a moment, but let's get to some of our viewers. William is on the phone from Mico, Florida, on the Democrats line with Frank Gaffney. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve. How you doing?
Good morning.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Mr. Gaffney was part of that project for a new American century, along with Pearl and Wolfowitz, and what his response might be to the fact that McCain and Colin Powell both rejected Guantanamo because it violates the Geneva Convention. All right, thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you, William.
You know, I wish that a fraction of the attention that my various other associations have had over the years were given to them as to this project that the gentleman has spoken of. It is on my Wikipedia profile, so I guess it keeps turning up. As I recall, there were 2 statements that that group issued, and my name was on it. I continue to agree with the statements, but it's hardly the high point of my career that that organization existed or that I was associated with it. As to John McCain and Colin Powell's support for the closure of Guantanamo Bay, I think both of them, I know Senator McCain, and I suspect Secretary Powell, would take the view that decide what you're going to do with the occupants before you close it. President Bush said he wanted to close Guantanamo Bay, but he couldn't figure out what to do with these people in a manner that was as secure and as safe for the American people as keeping them there, so he continued to operate it. And to be honest with you, I don't think there is a more secure place. Even if you were to take the president at his word and that there are supermax facilities, as they're called in the United States, that you could put them in, that they could be safely and securely housed in, and that they would not, as the FBI director has said, become rock stars and greatly compound the problem that we already have, as we saw in this case in New York this week, with radicals in America's prisons converting others to their form of Shariah adherent Islam. That is an abiding problem. But beyond that, you've got, I think, the likelihood that communities outside of the prisons might become the targets of terrorist attack in the future. So for all these reasons, I think keeping the facility open, at least until we come up with a better idea, is necessary.
But let me read to you what Senator Carl Levin said, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, this morning inside the Washington Post, because he is saying that President Obama's order to end abusive interrogations and close Guantanamo Bay struck a blow against propaganda. He also says that we need our allies to combat terrorism, and we need to have a better chance of enlisting their support if we recognize the impact of the abuses at Guantanamo.
Yeah. Look, this is a matter on which honest people can honorably disagree. I fundamentally disagree with Senator Levin. I think in this case, our allies have played a bit of a double game. They've been happy to rail against Guantanamo Bay, and yet they have no interest in taking any of the prisoners. I think that suggests that they recognize that this is a facility that is, in fact, important. They just don't want to be blamed for any association with it. Certainly, they don't want to have any such facility on their soil. As to the question of recruitment and training, I guess this is always a subjective thing. I'm sure that you could talk to Al-Qaeda operatives who will tell you, oh yes, I signed up because of Guantanamo Bay. I think that very unlikely. But again, you got to weigh it. What is their general view going to be? What is the upside and downside of closing it? Put into the equation. Will it become a propaganda tool that we Al-Qaeda, we have the Shariah strain, we have successfully forced the greatest power in the world to close the greatest detention facility in the world? I think that nets out better from their point of view than it does from ours.
The writings and now the web video on your website,
Yes.
Interviews done by Frank Gaffney.
Vlogs.
All of it. What do you call them?
Vlogs.
You call them vlogs too, sure. You can get it at centerforsecuritypolicy.org. A link available through cspan.org. Carl is next from New Augusta, Mississippi. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to make an interesting point. You know, if we were to try the people in Guantanamo Bay, we might bring out some truths that the Republicans did protect this country, and I think the Democrats are afraid to admit that President Bush and Vice President Cheney did protect the American people, and there's definite proof of that. We haven't had a terrorist attack on our soil. The other thing I wanted to remind the Democrats is that during '03, after 9/11, President Obama did not vote for the $87 billion to fund our troops. And they were arguing back and forth about the $87 billion. Do we have this kind of money? Well, it seems like we had the kind of money to bail out GM and AIG. And so we couldn't take care of the troops. And during this Memorial Day weekend, I want us to remember the troops that are over there right now defending us, that we can argue back and forth, Republican and Democrat. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, let me join in that salute to both those serving today and the veterans, and most especially those who have fallen in the service of our country. Look, the question of the amount of money available for our military is a very well taken point. I personally believe that to the extent that we have decided to essentially open the Treasury for all manner of spending, it is a scandal that some, if you will, shovel-ready programs that employ tens of thousands of Americans that would be valuable not only to building the equipment that those men and women in uniform need for today's wars, and by the way, for tomorrow's, which almost certainly will require different equipment and capabilities than today's. Those are not being funded. And instead, essentially anything that can be conceivably construed as of utility on the domestic side is being funded essentially without question and check. And that really worries me. As to the issue of what would happen if people like some of the Guantanamo detainees were to be put on trial, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I think there would be some evidence that you have very dangerous people there, and thank God the previous administration successfully apprehended them and put them away. I worry, I have to say, though, that the trials would unavoidably involve the disclosure to the defense and thereby to their confreres around the world valuable intelligence about what we do to counter these terrorists and how we do it. And again, it's a question of how do you net this stuff out. I think even the president has now acknowledged, President Obama, who railed against the administration preceded him for how it handled these detainees, even he has now said there are some of these folks that we're simply not going to be able to bring to trial at all, and others that we're going to have military commissions, which he again inveighed against, to minimize the likelihood that we will compromise very sensitive intelligence information to our enemies. So these are the sorts of things that make this very complicated, and why I don't envy the president the choices that he has to make. I just think he's made the wrong one in terms of closing Guantanamo and then trying to figure out what to do with their occupants.
In addition to serving as the president and the founder of the Center for Security Policy, some background on our guest, Frank Gaffney. He served in a number of capacities in the Reagan administration and the Defense Department, a graduate of Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins University, and you share something in common with Jeane Kirkpatrick. You both worked for Senator Henry Scoop Jackson.
Well, I had the privilege of studying under Jeane Kirkpatrick when I was at Georgetown University, and I don't know that she worked for Scoop, but she certainly was closely associated with him in a number of ways. But she was a great friend, and we much miss her these days.
We did an interview with her, and she talked about her admiration of Senator Jackson. And my question to you is there a Scoop Jackson in the Democratic Party today?
Well, Jim Woolsey continues to think of himself as a Scoop Jackson Democrat. He's not an elected official, of course. The closest one I can think of in the party today is Joe Lieberman, and he's not entirely in the party today as a result of, having been more or less driven out. There are a few others that probably come close. Steny Hoyer, I think, considers himself a Scoop Jackson Democrat. Elliot Engel in the House of Representatives. But they are, I would say with great respect for both of those men, I don't think they come close to the kind of mastery of the national security portfolio and the robustness that Scoop Jackson brought to it. And there isn't a day that goes by that I don't find myself missing him and wishing that were he here, that things would be different in our national politics today. I don't think you'd see the kind of fault lines that have now been drawn on the most important national security issues of our day. He brought to it a bipartisanship long before there was a Ronald Reagan revolution. He was working with another of my old bosses, John Tower, on the Republican side of the aisle in the Senate to promote the philosophy that Reagan called peace through strength, and we really miss that in the party today.
One tweet that we got is somebody who's saying, I like this guest. We'll go on to Jay, who's joining us from Norfolk, Virginia. Good morning.
Hello, Mr. Gaffney.
Yes, sir.
I believe a lot of the problems we're facing today with the rest of the world is not as part of our problem is we stuck our nose in trying to clean up problems that the European colonialists started in Africa, Asia, Middle East, so on and so forth. We're getting the blame for something and getting a hammer thrown at us for trying to clean somebody else's mess up. If people go back and look, the European powers such as France, Germany, England, and so forth went into these countries, raped them, tore them apart, put person against person, religion against religion, nationality, so forth. Now, we've got to go clean it up. I don't believe that it's our problem, but we made it our problem.
I think there's something to what you said. There certainly have been places around the world that have been greatly worsened by colonialism, particularly of the European stripe. I think, on the other hand, there have been places that have been actually improved by particularly British colonial rule, given the tools by which they could self-rule. But look, the biggest problem we face around the world today, I think, bar none, is a product of something that I don't think had much to do with colonialism. It has to do with an ideology that is enshrined in authoritative Islam. They call it Shariah, and its mission, its stated objective, is the destruction of all of the unbelieving world and the rule through a global theocracy of an Islamic ruler and potentate, a caliph, if you will. That, I don't think, there may be some who justify it on the grounds that this is a response to European colonialism, but in fact it long predated European colonialism, and I think that it now is on the march in Europe and elsewhere in the free world, including here in America, in a way that is now a very, very real peril to our freedoms and our way of life.
Our guest is Frank Gaffney. Joe is next from Roseburg, Oregon. Good morning on the Democrats line.
Good morning, Steve. And thank God for C-SPAN. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
I don't know where to begin with this guy. First, I have to agree with the guy from Virginia, in it as much that this is an extension of the colonial nonsense that we know what all that's about.
How
and
so?
This is pardon me?
How so?
Well, in it as much that Iraq, along with Iran, was created by the colonial powers and basically just forgot about everybody in the Middle East, and everyone was a second-class citizen. But let me get more to the point here. Sir, I have to agree that, okay, in all respect, the whole thing with the Middle East, quite honestly, we're talking about what is needed here is a two-state solution, okay? We cannot deny the fundamental and alienable right for people to exist, to subsist. You cannot expect a Palestinian woman to send her family out into the world, and she has the right, as well as anyone on the face of the planet as a human being, to be able to send her family out unfettered and then be able to come back to them.
Joe, I'm going to stop you there. Oh, stay on the line because I want to follow up with you, but we'll get a response to that first point.
Well, I simply disagree that the end-all and be-all is a two-state solution. I think the theory here is that a two-state solution will be a means of bringing about a peaceable and stable Middle East, or at least the part involving the Arabs and the Israelis. I see no evidence of that at all. Under Hamas, and for that matter under Fatah, you have people who will take such a state, if they were to be given one, and use it to continue to pursue their stated goal, which is the destruction of the State of Israel. It's in not only the Hamas charter, it's in the Fatah charter, the PLO charter. So that, I think, means that were we to force Israel, as I say, I think the Barack Obama administration is doing right now, to make concessions that it would not otherwise make, rightly, in order to create this state without the underlying conditions being present that would possibly conduce to it being a real contribution to peace and stability, will just make things worse. Jim Woolsey, I mentioned a moment ago, just very quickly, I did a column this week, has a very interesting point. He says, when we get to the point where Palestinians treat Jews in a Palestinian entity the way Israel treats Arab citizens of the country, you might have the basis for a real Palestinian state that would be able to live in peace side by side with Israel. But at the moment, you know, the Palestinian view is that any area that they control should be Judenrein, as Hitler called it, should be eliminated of any traces of the Jews, let alone any population left there. And again, I think that will give rise to bigger problems, not fewer ones. And I just think that the monomaniacal focus of the administration on that is misplaced and likely to produce very bad results.
By the way, that piece available online at the Center for Security Policy is called "A Doomed to Repeat History." Listening to James Woolsey, speaker of truth, and also, as you mentioned, the advice put forth by Winston Churchill in his book, The Gathering Storm. Joe, I want to come back. Which
was basically, don't weaken your allies.
I want to come back to you, Joe, but also this email saying that Mr. Gaffney, put America first, stop supporting Israel's wars.
Well, look, again, my view of this is that there is a community of people broadly defined by those who adhere to Shariah, though there are others, unfortunately, who are making common cause with them, who seek to change the free world, either by enslaving it or by destroying it. And Israel is, in my estimation, on the front lines of that fight. I don't believe that we are fighting Israel's war. I believe Israel is fighting ours. And everyone that we're dealing with now, most especially the Iranians, which we talked about at the top of the show, are saying that Israel is the little Satan. We are the great Satan. They make no distinction between us except that Israel is sort of a speed bump on the way to getting at us. And so I think standing with your allies, supporting those who share your values and your commitment to freedom is a sensible policy, as Winston Churchill suggested decades ago.
Joe, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, please go ahead.
Steve, where is Hanan Shawari in all of this? Where is Hanan Shawari? We need to speak with her. I would like to see her back on the air, really.
We actually have an invitation to her. I believe she is back in the Palestinian territory, but you're absolutely right. We have had her on, and we'll continue to try to get her on. The last time we checked, she was not here in the States.
Hello?
Yes, you're on.
Are
the
you
forum
still
is yours. Yes, go ahead.
Shit. No. Okay. Look, I'm sorry. I don't agree with this at all. We need to find. Look, Israel is. I just think Israel's run amok, and look, you can't fence people off and expect them to feel normal. You know, you can't put people in a box and think you're going to have everything solved. History has proven when you start building walls, they don't work.
Well, look, the wall was created for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that it was to prevent Palestinians from crossing over into Israel and blowing up Seder dinners and weddings and buses and the people of Israel. The wall has worked. It has worked in that respect. Now, the folks in Hamas-controlled Gaza have chosen to send rockets across the wall or across the barriers there, and people are still being killed in Israel as a result. I don't believe Israel has run amok. I think it is trying to defend itself and has found every effort it has made to date, including many that I've disagreed with, frankly, because I've thought they were wildly risky in terms of the ability of the Israeli government to protect its people in the future. Witness what happened when they withdrew from Lebanon. Witness what happened when they withdrew from Gaza. Perhaps even what they've done by withdrawing from Sinai if the Egyptians become once again aggressively hostile, not just passively hostile. These are the sorts of things that I think confront an Israel surrounded by enemies, and weakening them, as I said earlier, I think we may well experiment with this, but I believe no good can come of it for them or for us.
We have a couple minutes left. Another tweet from a viewer wondering if America is better off than it was 8 years ago.
In a lot of respects, no. Obviously, we've experienced a financial tsunami that has made everything in this country a lot more difficult. We have, I think, in some respects, improved our position by being more vigilant about some of the hostile forces at work. But even there, I think we are risking the gains that have been made by pursuing policies that seem rooted more, if I may use the term, in hope than in experience. And I think the president's views of some of these things seems to be changing as he has more experience and as he sees what would be the consequences of some of his promises, campaign and otherwise. But I'm very concerned that we're at a moment in history where important forces are at work, and to a very considerable degree they are not compatible with or supportive of or even friendly to our way of life and the kinds of freedoms that many of us take for granted. And Memorial Day is a good time to be remembering what those freedoms are all about and the sacrifice that's been entailed in trying to protect them in the past.
Frank is next. He's joining us on the phone from Bradford, Pennsylvania, on the Republican line. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Mr. Gaffney, I'm a Republican who opposed the war in Iraq. And I don't think Gitmo is an excuse for that war. You must consider that the Shariah has engulfed the area now, and we have created that. This was probably the worst thing for Israel. You have a situation where we probably have $3 billion worth of exhausted military equipment, the trillions of dollars and the lives. And what we find out, Iran now has a missile. For 6 years, this has been what I call Cheney stupidity. And talking about waterboarding, he looked like James Cagney. This war was a colossal mistake. Horrible. And the reality of it is hitting home. We have really exhausted our military. We ignored our military. You think Scowcroft and Odoms and them men were stupid? We let the lobbyists take over this war. And nothing disappointed me more to see John McCain with Joe Lieberman, who was a lobbyist for this war. I am a soldier. I was in Korea. I had friends whose sons were killed in Beirut. And I look at Cheney like a mole, because I don't think Reagan even knew the military wanted those men out of there. And when I say he looked like the K Mutiny, he did. No good for the Republican Party. Clean itself out. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your service, sir. I must say I disagree with you on several of your points, but perhaps most especially at the moment, let's just talk about Iraq. It's impossible to say with any certainty what Iraq would look like today had Saddam Hussein remained in power, and the war that you ascribe to Dick Cheney, which I think is unfair, or to Joe Lieberman, which I think is unfair. It was a decision taken by the United States government as a whole with strong support from the Congress on both sides of the aisle. It's easy to forget that now because a lot of the folks who supported it then have now distanced themselves from that support or claim that they were lied to, which is not true. But I think it's fair to say that had Saddam Hussein remained in power even a few months longer probably, but certainly by now, he would have been out from under the sanctions that the international community, such as it is, had imposed upon him. He would once again have been free to sell his oil anywhere around the world. And we know for a fact, based on what was found on the ground when our Iraq survey group went in after the liberation of Iraq, when the sanctions came off, he was going to be back in the weapons of mass destruction business. I believe that would have included nuclear weapons. It certainly was going to be more chemical and biological agents. And by the way, one of the very interesting things that that survey group's report found, which got almost no attention at the time or even since then, was that had he been able to resume production on a large scale of those chemical and biological agents, he said the plan was to put some of those agents in aerosol cans and perfume sprayers for shipment to the United States and Europe. In other words, specifically, precisely the kind of terrorist threat of weapons of mass destruction use against the American people and our allies that President Bush was concerned about in the post-9/11 timeframe. So let me just leave it at that by saying I think that we won't know for sure, and the costs have been high, but I believe the costs of inaction in the face of that kind of danger would have been even greater than what we face today. And just finally, don't kid yourself, sir. Shariah is on the march today not because we have been resisting it, or not because we toppled a secular government in Iraq, a totalitarian one to be sure, but because of the abiding conviction of its adherents that they will triumph, that they will rule the world, and that it is God's will that they pursue that through jihad, both violent and stealthy.
Michael is next, our last call from Livonia, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling because a couple days ago I was watching an interview on CNN, I think, with Wolf Blitzer talking to a Pakistani ambassador. I'm not sure of his name right now, but he was but being very forceful about the disclosure of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, where all of them are located. And I can understand that, we're all a bit nervous about, they're fighting terrorists and we don't know where all their nuclear weapons are, and we're afraid that one of the terrorists might get a hold of them. But isn't it a bit understandable that Pakistan doesn't want to disclose that information, what with their, their relation with India and all that other business? And I don't think it's, that unfair that they don't want to give that information out to just anybody.
We'll get a response.
Yeah, it is understandable. It doesn't alter the fact that from our perspective, we'd like to know, because as John Bolton pointed out in a column a couple of weeks ago, we could well be facing a situation where perhaps even within weeks of the Taliban's assault on Islamabad, which again a couple of weeks ago seemed as though that might be any day, you could have the control over Pakistan's nuclear arsenal falling into the hands of some of the most dangerous people on the planet. Now, perhaps, as we talked about earlier, that threat is a little diminished now that the Pakistani government has taken aggressive action against the Taliban. My guess is this is a stay of execution rather than a commutation of the sentence, that we will see the Taliban at the throats of the Pakistani government in the future, that those nuclear weapons and their location will become an even more vivid concern for the United States government. But that said, I certainly can understand why the Pakistani government will want to try to be as opaque as possible on both the status and the whereabouts of their weapons.
In our remaining minute, we have a regular viewer who asked if I would bring something up from an article that appeared back in 2002 in The Nation magazine by Jason Vest. And one of the points in the article was that Frank Gaffney and his prescriptions for national security have been fairly simple. Gut all arms control treaties, push ahead with weapon systems virtually everyone agrees should be killed, give no quarter to the Palestinians, and most important, go full steam ahead on just about every national missile defense program. Response?
Wow. How many minutes have we got? Look, as I said at the outset, I have subscribed all my life, starting with Scoop Jackson and John Tower and Ronald Reagan, to the philosophy of peace through strength. I believe that arms control agreements have almost always wound up promising more than they deliver, that they are almost always unverifiable, that they are almost always made with parties who choose to violate them rather than adhere to them, whereas we must adhere to them. It's just a matter of our government's honor and the oversight processes that enforce that honor. I don't think my support for military programs is without some thought given to their value and their importance in terms of the kind of world that we're talking about. But I will say, national missile defense, or more to the point, global missile defense has always seemed to me to be an eminently sensible thing in a world in which, as we talked about earlier, most recently the Iranians are building these ballistic missiles, the North Koreans, the Russians are in the process of modernizing theirs, ditto the Chinese. They're being sold all over the world to third world and other countries. To have defenses against them is just eminently sensible, and I think, I guess if I were to say anything about my philosophy, it's common sense. And I think on this point especially, the native common sense of the American people has always been strong and abiding. They appreciate that we need to have defenses against these sorts of threats, and I pray that Barack Obama will change his mind on his view that we should constrict, if not eliminate, our missile defenses and get back into new arms control treaties with the Russians that will, I'm afraid, have all of the qualities that I just talked about.
We encourage our viewers to log on to your website at centerforsecuritypolicy.org, and our guest, Frank Gaffney, who's been with us. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure.
Please come back again.
Happy Memorial Day.